Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where we uncover the darkest crimes and the hidden truths behind them. Tonight, we revisit one of history's most shocking assassinations, a crime that didn't just end a man's life but silenced the dream of an entire generation. It was April 4, 1968, when a single bullet tore through the heart of America, striking down Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the man who had become the voice of hope, justice, and equality. But behind that trigger was more than just a man, it was a system, a fear, and a conspiracy. This is that story. Asterisk. The night in Memphis was not like any other for those who carried the weight of history in their hearts because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had returned once more to the city to lend his voice to the sanitation workers, strike a movement born out of dignity and justice and the demand for equality. The Lorraine Motel stood calm against the darkening sky, its neon sign glowing faintly as if it too bore witness to the battles of the time. For days King had been speaking, marching, rallying, and despite exhaustion his presence remained a source of fire for those who had placed their hopes in him. Yet surrounding that flame were shadows that grew heavier with each word he spoke, because his message was not just about civil rights. It was about dismantling systems of oppression that had been protected for centuries. Every step he took toward justice pulled him closer to the crosshairs of hatred. Dr. King had grown accustomed to threats, death calls, letters filled with venomous warnings, and crowds where hatred festered were nothing new to him. But still he walked with calm, knowing that his life had become more than his own. It belonged to the millions who had chosen to believe that nonviolence could reshape a nation drenched in blood. That night Memphis was tense with expectation. His aides and close friends knew the risks, yet they also knew his determination. He was not a man who could be silenced by fear. He carried the weight of his last speech delivered just a night earlier, a haunting declaration where he spoke of the mountaintop and glimpsing the promised land, even if he would not enter it with his people. The words had stirred the crowd and unsettled many of his companions who felt as if he had sensed something looming on the horizon across from the Lorraine Motel in a small rooming house. A man was preparing for an act that would forever scar the nation. James Earl Ray, a drifter with a criminal past, had been watching King's movements with meticulous calculation. A Remington rifle lay in his hands, polished, cold, and patient. To Ray, this was more than a weapon. It was a means of shaping history, or at least inserting himself into it. He had studied King's routine, the way he leaned over the balcony to talk to his aides. The time he usually stepped out, the casual moments that seemed so ordinary yet predictable, while the streets outside carried the sounds of conversation and traffic. Ray's room was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor and the pounding of his own heartbeat. Inside the motel, King's team moved about with their usual rhythm. Ralph Abernathy and other close allies spoke with him about the march scheduled for the coming days, while laughter slipped between the cracks of weary planning. For a moment it felt almost safe, like a reprieve from the storms that always followed him. The Lorraine Motel had become a kind of refuge for leaders who came through Memphis, a place where the rooms carried not just travelers, but fragments of history. King's presence transformed its atmosphere, filling it with both hope and danger. His friends joked to lighten the weight they carried, while King himself remained reflective, quietly aware of the thin line between destiny and death that he had walked for years. Memphis itself was a city divided. A sanitation workers' strike had revealed the deep fractures between its black working-class population and a system that saw them as expendable. Their demands for fair wages and safe conditions had grown into a symbol of resistance, a reminder that dignity was not negotiable. King's arrival had magnified that tension, drawing both support and hostility. To those who stood with him, his presence was a shield against despair, but to his enemies, his presence was provocation, a spark they desperately wished to extinguish. Whispers traveled through the city, through bars and offices, and even corridors of power, that King's growing influence had become dangerous not just to segregationists, but to those in Washington who viewed him as a disruptor of the American order. As the evening settled in, King walked through the motel hallways, his footsteps echoing softly on the worn floor. The air was thick with spring humidity, carrying with it a strange stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He spoke with members of his team, offering words of encouragement, reminding them that the struggle was not just about Memphis but about the soul of a nation. His voice was calm, yet charged with the fire of conviction. To those who listened, it felt as though he carried an unshakable faith that victory, though distant, was inevitable. Yet beneath the strength, there lingered the quiet exhaustion of a man who had given everything to a cause larger than life itself. In the shadows across the street, Ray adjusted his position, peering through the scope of his rifle, rehearsing the deadly line of sight over and over. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight, his world reduced to the narrow view of a weapon aimed at history. To him, King was not just a man on a balcony. He was a target, the embodiment of everything Ray believed threatened his world. Each breath he took steadied his hands. Each sound from the street below reminded him that the opportunity was slipping closer. Outside, people laughed, cars passed the city, moved unaware that it was on the brink of tragedy that would shake the globe. King stepped into his room for a brief moment before preparing to join his companions. The night was not yet old, but it carried with it a strange heaviness, a sensation his aides could not explain. Some would later recall feeling uneasy, though none could articulate why. Perhaps it was the way King seemed unusually reflective, speaking of life and death with a calm that felt prophetic. Perhaps it was simply the weight of the years of threats finally pressing in. Either way, the Lorraine Motel that night was not just a place of rest, it was a stage, and every figure upon it unknowingly played their role in a scene that would be remembered forever. The air outside the Lorraine Motel was warm and sticky, with the heaviness of a southern evening settling in over Memphis. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange fading into a darkening blue. In that dusky glow, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. opened the door to room 306 and stepped out onto the balcony with the same calm dignity he carried everywhere he went. He was dressed neatly as always in a dark suit, his tie adjusted just so, a small gesture of order in a world that often felt like chaos. From below in the courtyard, some of his friends and fellow leaders stood talking and laughing, exchanging small jokes to ease the exhaustion of their long fight. King leaned over the railing, his voice carrying with the warm breeze as he spoke casually to Jesse Jackson and others. Below, his tone light, as though the weight of history resting on his shoulders could be momentarily set aside in that brief moment. The world seemed ordinary. It was a man standing on a balcony, calling down to friends, smiling, adjusting his tie, nothing more than an everyday act. But beneath that ordinary scene, a storm was waiting to break. Across the street in the dingy rooming house, James Earl Ray crouched in position, the wooden stock of a Remington rifle pressed firmly against his shoulder. He had been waiting, watching, patient, like a predator circling prey. Through the scope, his entire world narrowed to the figure of King, framed perfectly by the balcony railing. He could see the way King leaned casually over the side, how the light from the setting sun glinted faintly on his suit, the precise target that his hateful determination demanded. Ray's breathing slowed in rhythm with his heartbeat as he steadied himself. He had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing in his mind how he would line up the shot, how he would escape, how the world would react. To him, this was not just murder, it was an act he believed would change history, a twisted belief born out of hate and obsession. In his mind, King was not a man of peace, but a dangerous agitator, someone who threatened the world Ray thought he understood. He had convinced himself that this single act would make him significant, that the shot he was about to fire would carve his name into history's pages. And so he lay hidden, watching, waiting for the perfect second when the dreamer would no longer be untouchable. Down below, the scene was filled with laughter and small talk. Andrew Young cracked a joke, Jesse Jackson replied with a grin, and others in the group joined in with chuckles. For a fleeting second it was easy to forget that King was a man living under constant threat. The FBI had files on him, the government had tracked his every move, and hate groups plotted in the shadows, yet here he stood exposed, vulnerable, his life hanging by a thread he could not see. He smiled down at his friends, a smile that carried both warmth and weariness, a man who had been carrying the hopes of millions, and yet still found time to share in the smallest joys of companionship. It was these ordinary moments that made his assassination all the more chilling, because they showed the humanity of a man who had become larger than life inside. His room, Ralph Abernathy had just stepped away for a moment, expecting King to follow soon for dinner. Others were preparing for the evening ahead, unaware that history was about to fracture. King rested his hands on the railing, leaned forward, and exchanged words once more with his companions below. He asked about music, he laughed at a remark, and for a breath of time, the world was filled with nothing but simplicity. Yet behind the walls across the street, Ray tightened his grip, his finger brushing against the trigger. The rifle was steady, the scope locked onto the silhouette of King's head and chest. He inhaled deeply, held the air in his lungs, and in that stillness the line between life and death was no thicker than the glass of the scope through which he peered. The shot exploded like a thunderclap, tearing apart the night's fragile calm. A burst of sound that echoed through the streets, sharp, violent, merciless. King's body jerked violently, the force of the bullet ripping through him, sending him collapsing backward onto the balcony floor. Blood spread quickly, staining the concrete beneath him, as his friends screamed in disbelief, their laughter silenced in an instant. Andrew Young and others rushed up the stairs, desperate cries filling the air as chaos consumed the motel. People ran in every direction, some in horror, some in confusion, but all of them knowing deep inside that something irreversible had just taken place. The man who had spoken of peace, of justice, of love, had been struck down by hatred, manifested in a single bullet. The smell of gunpowder lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood, as panic swept through the courtyard. Jesse Jackson stood frozen in shock, his eyes fixed on King's body, while others dropped to their knees trying to tend to him, pressing claws against the wound, pleading with him to hold on. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as police rushed toward the scene. But for those standing there, time seemed to slow, the world blurring into a haze of disbelief and sorrow. The echo of the gunshot still rang in their ears, as if the very earth itself was mourning across the street. Ray pulled back from the window, his pulse racing. He had fired the shot, the bullet had found its mark, and in his mind the mission was complete. Without hesitation, he scrambled to gather his things, the rifle quickly abandoned as he fled the room with desperate urgency. His plan for escape was already in motion, a plan to vanish into the cracks of the world before the weight of his crime could close in on him. While King lay bleeding on the balcony, Ray disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the devastation of his actions and the chaos he had unleashed. Back at the Lorraine Motel, people screamed, prayed, and cried as King lay motionless. His companions leaned over him, speaking his name, pleading for him to stay alive, their hands stained with his blood, their hearts breaking as they realized the enormity of what had just been stolen from them. The dreamer who had spoken of mountaintops, who had envisioned a land of justice and peace, now lay silent as the city of Memphis plunged into grief and the nation into mourning. Sirens pierced the night, cutting through the cries and confusion that had swallowed the Lorraine Motel. Police cars raced toward the scene, their red and blue lights flashing against the motel's pale walls, casting everything in a surreal glow. Crowds began to gather outside, people rushing from nearby streets, pulled by the sound of tragedy unfolding. For those on the balcony and in the courtyard below, there was no time to comprehend, only the instinct to help, to scream, to pray. Dr. King lay bleeding, his breathing shallow, his friends kneeling beside him, unable to stop the flow of life draining from him. Reporters who had followed his movements quickly arrived their cameras, capturing images that would soon circle the world, forever freezing that moment in time. In the middle of it all, a single question burned in the hearts of those who loved him. How could this have happened? The Memphis police moved quickly to cordon off the area, pushing people back as they tried to secure the motel. Officers ran into the rooming house across the street, but by then James Earl Ray was already gone. The weapon had been discarded, fingerprints left behind carelessly, yet the man himself had vanished into the night. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts, some swearing they had seen a white Mustang speeding away, others claiming they caught only glimpses of a man in flight. Within hours, investigators began piecing together the first strands of evidence, but the questions came faster than the answers. How could one of the most threatened men in America be so exposed standing on an open balcony with no serious protection? Why had there been no coordinated security for a man who had already been targeted countless times before? These questions hung in the smoky night unanswered, heavy with suspicion. As news spread across Memphis, chaos spilled into the streets. Word reached the sanitation workers who had been striking under King's guidance, and their sorrow turned into outrage. Across the city, riots erupted, fires lit up the skyline as grief morphed into fury. For many, King had been the last beacon of hope, the proof that nonviolence could prevail in a world built on cruelty and hatred. His death felt like betrayal, like proof that America would never allow equality to be won without blood. Shops were looted, police clashed with protesters, and the city burned while King lay lifeless in the hospital, where doctors could do nothing more than pronounce him gone. His death was not just the end of a man, it was the tearing open of a wound that had never healed. In Washington, officials scrambled to prepare statements, but behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. King had been under constant surveillance by the FBI, monitored, recorded, followed relentlessly by a government that feared his influence. He was not only challenging segregation, but also the war in Vietnam and the nation's economic systems, daring to criticize policies that reached into the highest levels of power. To those who sat in those offices, his voice was dangerous, a threat to stability and control. Now, with his assassination suspicions ignited, was James Earl Ray truly acting alone? Or was he a pawn in a larger plot woven by forces determined to silence King's message before it grew too powerful to contain? Even within King's circle of friends and allies, the doubt lingered, gnawing at their grief. James Earl Ray, meanwhile, was already on the run. Using false identities and a carefully planned escape route, he traveled quickly south, disappearing from Memphis and slipping across state lines. He abandoned his car, switched buses, moved through crowded stations where no one noticed the ordinary face of a man who had just altered the course of history. Weeks later, he would find himself in Canada, then London, moving with a desperation fueled not by remorse, but by fear of capture. In his wake, he left only questions and a trail of suspicion that would stretch across continents. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in its history, but even as they pursued him, theories of conspiracy spread faster than the official story could keep up. Back in Memphis, King's death left devastation among those who had stood closest to him. Ralph Abernathy, broken with grief, vowed to carry on the struggle, but admitted that without King's leadership, the movement had lost its unshakable center. Jesse Jackson carried the image of his mentor's final moments, burned into his mind, forever haunted by the sound of that shot. Andrew Young struggled to keep faith alive among the people who no longer believed that nonviolence could protect them from a world so cruel. At King's funeral, the sorrow was overwhelming. Thousands gathered to pay their respects while millions more watched across the country, their tears mingling with anger. It was not just a funeral, it was a reckoning, a nation staring into the abyss of its own sins. Investigators claimed they had enough evidence to tie Ray to the crime, the rifle, fingerprints, maps, and receipts, forming what they called a solid case. Yet the story seemed too neat, too convenient for many who had lived through the paranoia and surveillance that shadowed King's life. Could a drifter with a petty criminal background have orchestrated such a clean assassination alone? Why did he escape so easily? Why did the government seem so quick to close the case before the deeper questions could be answered? Civil rights leaders demanded answers, but the official line was firm: James Earl Ray acted alone. Still, the whispers never faded. They echoed through the years, through courtrooms, through books and documentaries, through the voices of King's family, themselves, who would later question the narrative the government had sealed in stone as America mourned. Cities across the country erupted in unrest. Washington, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, all burned with the rage of people who had lost their leader. Soldiers patrolled the streets, tanks rolled through neighborhoods while leaders begged for calm. President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation, calling for unity and urging Americans to honor King's legacy, but the words fell hollow against the backdrop of smoke rising from the cities. The dream King had spoken of seemed shattered, replaced with despair and violence. For many, the bullet had done more than take his life. It had silenced the fragile belief that justice could ever be won without war. Yet within that grief there was also resolve, a refusal among some to let his death mark the end of the struggle. In that moment, the Lorraine Motel ceased to be just a place to sleep. It became a monument to loss, a shrine to the man who had fallen there. The balcony where King's body collapsed was no longer ordinary concrete. It was history stained by sacrifice. Those who had been present replayed the sound of the shot in their minds over and over, each detail etched permanently into memory. And as the investigation dragged on and suspicions mounted, the unanswered questions only deepened the tragedy, making it clear that this was more than just the story of a lone gunman. It was the story of a nation fractured by hate, fear, and power, struggling to face the truth of what had been done. When James Earl Ray was finally captured in London's Heathrow Airport, 2 months after the assassination, the world expected the answers that had been haunting it to finally come to light. He had been traveling under a false name, carrying fake documents and attempting to flee to a country that had no extradition treaty with the United States. His capture was sudden and anticlimactic for a man whose single act had thrown an entire nation into chaos. Authorities announced that the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr. had been caught, and with that declaration, many believed the case was closed. But beneath the surface, doubt had already begun to fester, and the arrest did little to silence the storm of questions surrounding King's death. Ray quickly confessed to the crime in exchange for avoiding a trial and the death penalty. But within days he recanted, claiming he had been manipulated and used as a scapegoat. The simplicity of the official narrative clashed violently with the complexity of the reality that people had witnessed. Government insisted that Ray had acted alone, a drifter motivated by racism and desperation, who took it upon himself to eliminate King. The FBI pointed to fingerprints, maps, hotel receipts, and the rifle found near the crime scene as undeniable evidence. Yet for many, the story seemed too neat, too clean to match the tangled web of surveillance, hatred, and politics that had defined King's life in the months before his death. The FBI itself had labeled him the most dangerous man in America, and J. Edgar Hoover had dedicated years to attempting to discredit him. King had been watched, tracked, and recorded. His phones tapped, his hotel rooms bugged. It seemed unthinkable to his allies that such a heavily monitored man could be killed without the knowledge or involvement of forces far greater than a small-time criminal like Ray. And so whispers of conspiracy spread like wildfire. Ray claimed he had not fired the shot that killed King, that he had been involved in a larger plan orchestrated by shadowy figures who promised him money and protection. He claimed he was only a pawn who had been maneuvered into Memphis at the right time and place, and then abandoned once the bullet struck its target. Over the years his story shifted, but the core remained the same. He insisted he was not the true assassin. Many dismissed his claims as attempts to escape guilt, but others listened carefully, pointing out the glaring inconsistencies in the investigation. Why were there no eyewitnesses who could clearly identify Ray pulling the trigger? Why was the Crime scene so quickly cleaned up, destroying valuable evidence. Why did it take so long for police to secure the rooming house where the shot was fired? These unanswered questions kept the fire of suspicion alive. King's family themselves came to believe that the official story was incomplete. His wife Coretta Scott King and their children openly stated their belief that the assassination was part of a larger conspiracy involving elements of the government. In later years, even a civil court case concluded that there had been a conspiracy to kill King, though the ruling never overturned the official narrative. For many Americans, the truth about who ordered the killing and why remained hidden in the shadows, buried beneath layers of secrecy. It became not just a question of justice, but a reflection of America itself, a mirror of the nation's struggle with race, power, and truth. The bullet that ended King's life had not only silenced his voice, but had unleashed decades of doubt, suspicion, and grief that never fully healed. Meanwhile, the legacy of King grew larger than the men who had tried to silence him. His death sparked riots across more than 100 American cities, but it also solidified his place as a martyr for justice. His speeches were replayed, his words studied, and his dream carried forward by those who refused to let hatred have the final say. Streets were named in his honor, statues erected, and holidays declared. But for those who had walked with him in life, who had heard his laughter, seen his weariness, and shared his dreams, the loss was deeply personal. They remembered not only the public leader, but the man who cracked jokes, who carried books with him wherever he went, who found strength in prayer, and who knew long before that April evening that his life would likely be taken for the cause he refused to abandon. Ray spent the rest of his life in prison, a figure both infamous and enigmatic. He continued to file appeals and requests for a new trial until his death in 1998, insisting he was innocent of the actual murder. To some, he was nothing more than a racist killer who destroyed one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. To others, he was a patsy, a tool used to cover up a crime that reached much deeper than he ever could. In the end, his life faded quietly behind bars, but the questions surrounding him never did. They remain part of the story, as inseparable as the sound of that single shot echoing across the balcony in Memphis. The Lorraine Motel was later transformed into the National Civil Rights Museum, a place where visitors could stand on the very balcony where King fell and look across the street at the boarding house from which the fatal bullet was fired. It became both a shrine and a warning, a reminder of how fragile hope can be and how costly the fight for justice often is. Every year people travel there not only to remember King, but to confront the dark truth of what hatred and fear can create. The sight of that balcony frozen in time still stirs silence in the hearts of those who stand before it. It is more than history, it is a scar that continues to speak. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. His life and death became proof of how steep that arc can be, how much struggle and sacrifice it demands. Though a bullet silenced his voice, it could not silence his dream. That dream still echoes in the chants of protesters, in the songs of movements, in the prayers of churches, and in the hearts of those who refuse to accept oppression as destiny. The assassin may have pulled the trigger, but the message refused to die. It grew louder, carried by millions across generations. The bullet that was meant to end him instead turned him into a symbol too powerful to ever be erased. And so even in death, King triumphed, because though the man was taken, the dream lived on forever.